Greetings, this is the Questing GM, and this is RPG Day 2020 for the day 24. And the word of the day is humor. In some ways, you could say that humor is the default play state. When people get together and play a role-playing game together, I think it's more natural for people to be on the humorous aspect of their characters rather than being immersed in their characters. At least the players that I've played with. Maybe there's a different kind of upbringing that we have in terms of how we get into role-playing games, so it's more rare for someone to be very immersed in their character, role-playing their characters, and even developing their characters to even to reach that state. It's more likely for you to get players who are more basing their characters either on archetypes or stereotypes. They are more likely to get into playing them humorously rather than playing them in character, so to speak. It was something that I had to really grind against. That didn't felt like it was the part of the role-playing experience. But as years gone by, I figured that if it's something that's more natural for the players to do, then why not embrace it? Why not keep humor as part of the play? Controversial take or the controversial opinion of having such an idea is that humor is sort of the opposite of immersion in terms of a in-character state. That means definitely grind certain gears for some players. But for myself, I feel that I'm more interested or more inclined towards what's natural for the players. If they are, Mr. Fancy Pants as their character's name, and character trait that is more for comedy rather than in being in character, let them play that character as the way they want it, because trying to urge or trying to force them to play in character in a more serious manner is probably just not going to work. It's probably going to backfire in more cases than it needs to be. This is really something that really depends on the players that you get, and if there is a clash of taste, if you have someone who much rather play as a character and then you have another person who rather much plays as a humorous character, there is some extent that GM can mediate between this, like being able to switch around between a lighthearted and a more serious tone. But I think it will eventually come to a point where both of these players will not see eye to eye, and then basically things doesn't work out. So it's best to just go separate ways in this case. And the funny thing is, because when humor is such an easy part or that gets into the role playing, I have personally tried to say, why not run a humorous campaign? And it's actually quite difficult if when I did it. Trying to force humor gives a different kind of challenge than improvisational humor in that sense. Forced humor has to be really well written, has to be really really witty. It runs on comedy principles and writing. So it was actually quite difficult, and it turns out there was actually much more work to do a comedy humor campaign, rather than just doing a normal campaign and then just expecting humor to just come into it as often as natural as it is. I've really nothing against humor in my games. I think it's part of having fun in that way, and maybe it's one of the easiest way to have fun as a GM. That puts me in the check. Like, I have to know what kind of players that I have, and this is something that we tend to discuss in a session zero manner, in the sense that if I may propose a certain tone that this may not be as humorous as it meant to be, but if I don't say anything on that front, and going in with a more casual approach, I'm more likely to expect humor more than more than trying to curb it. Humor is probably one of those topics that has to be discussed in some ways. As a GM, there are definitely some games that I want to run that doesn't really work when there's humor put into it. My base expectation and assumptions when people are playing a game with role-playing game with me is more likely that there is going to be humorous elements, and mostly unintentional ones, that's going to be into my game rather than not. I'm not going to expect people to be immersed in their characters unless it's something that's been discussed. If there's one final thing that I maybe just want to bring up is humorous RPGs. Is there any RPG that is built around humor? Maybe as some sort of comedy improvisational tool, like something maybe along the lines of Whose Line Is It Anyway? There are definitely some settings that I think lend towards more humor, like Discworld, and there is a Discworld RPG, but I've never really played it, so I'm not exactly sure how does the mechanics sort of influence or has a contribution to the humor of the setting itself, which is something that probably be interested to have a look at if anyone has any recommendations or suggestions uh, on RPGs or campaign settings that is centered around humor. So yeah, so I think that'll be all for me for on this topic for RPG A Day 2020 for day 24 humor, and I'll be seeing you all on day 25.